The story of The Greedy Milkman begins with the introduction of its protagonist, a milkman who, despite earning a decent living, becomes dissatisfied and desires more wealth and luxury. This seemingly simple character introduction sets the stage for a deeper exploration of human nature, greed, and the consequences of unethical decisions. The milkman, named Ramesh, was well known in his village for supplying fresh milk to the households every morning. He had inherited the business from his father, who had spent years building a reputation for honesty and quality. Ramesh's father always believed that integrity and hard work were the pillars of a successful life. Under his guidance, the milk business flourished, and the family lived a modest but comfortable life. However, after Ramesh took over the business, his perspective on wealth and success changed. Unlike his father, who found contentment in a simple life, Ramesh aspired for grander things. He would often watch the wealthy landowners and merchants in the village riding their fine horses, dressed in silk garments, and hosting extravagant feasts. The sight of their luxury filled him with an insatiable longing. He wondered why he should settle for an ordinary life when others lived in opulence. At first, Ramesh worked diligently, ensuring that his milk was of the highest quality, just as his father had taught him. However, as his ambition grew, so did his impatience. He realized that despite his hard work, his earnings were limited. He began to feel that honest labor alone could not bring him the wealth he desired. This thought festered in his mind, slowly corroding his ethical foundation. Ramesh's dissatisfaction was fueled by comparisons and envy. Every time he saw a wealthy man in the village, he felt an internal sting of inadequacy. He started believing that life was unfair, that despite his efforts, he would always remain a simple milkman, while others enjoyed the riches of the world. This comparison led to a dangerous mindset. He began to seek shortcuts to wealth. One day, as he measured the milk before delivering it, a thought crossed his mind. What if he added a little water to the milk? The villagers trusted him, and a small dilution would be almost unnoticeable. If he sold diluted milk, he could increase his profits without additional effort. At first, the idea seemed dishonest, but the allure of easy money was tempting. He convinced himself that he was merely doing what was necessary to improve his life. Initially, he diluted the milk with only a small amount of water, ensuring that the taste and consistency remained nearly the same. When he saw that no one noticed, his greed grew bolder. He began adding more water each day, steadily increasing his profits. With the extra money, he started indulging in small luxuries, buying finer clothes, eating at the best eateries, and even considering purchasing a larger house. However, what began as a small act of deception quickly turned into a habit. Ramesh no longer felt guilty about his actions. Instead, he justified them by telling himself that everyone in business found ways to maximize their earnings. His greed blinded him to the values his father had upheld, and he became increasingly careless. As his wealth grew, so did his arrogance. He started looking down on the very villagers he once served with humility. He no longer saw them as people but as mere customers, sources of income rather than individuals who depended on him for quality milk. His relationships with others became transactional, and he began to distance himself from those who questioned his sudden prosperity. But greed is a bottomless pit, and no amount of wealth seemed to satisfy Ramesh. Despite his growing earnings, he always felt he needed more. He began dreaming of expanding his business, perhaps even hiring others to do the deliveries so he could focus solely on increasing profits. He envisioned himself as a rich merchant, respected and admired by the entire village. However, greed comes with consequences. While the villagers initially failed to notice the decline in milk quality, suspicions eventually arose. The milk no longer tasted as rich as it once had, and some households even complained that it spoiled too quickly. Whispers of doubt spread through the village, and soon, people began questioning whether Ramesh was being honest. This was the turning point in Ramesh's story. His unchecked greed, which had given him temporary wealth, now threatened to destroy the very foundation of his livelihood. He had betrayed the trust of the community, and as doubt grew, so did the risk of his downfall. The introduction of the milkman in this story is not just about a man who desires wealth, it is a profound commentary on human nature. Ramesh represents the universal struggle between ambition and morality, between contentment and greed. His dissatisfaction with a decent but modest life led him to unethical choices, illustrating how the hunger for more can blind one to the values that truly matter. Ultimately, the greedy milkman serves as a cautionary tale, warning us about the dangers of unchecked ambition and dishonesty. It reminds us that true success is not merely about wealth but about the integrity with which one earns it. Ramesh's downfall is a testament to the idea that greed, no matter how cleverly disguised, always leads to ruin in the end. Ramesh's descent into dishonesty began with a simple yet dangerous thought: what if he could make more money without increasing his efforts? He had already been feeling frustrated, watching others in the village grow wealthier while his own earnings remained modest. Though he was not struggling, his desire for a more luxurious life clouded his judgment. One morning, as he prepared the milk for delivery, he noticed the large metal containers filled with fresh, creamy milk. He had worked hard to collect it, just as his father had done before him. But then a thought crept into his mind: if he added a little water, he could increase the quantity without anyone noticing. The villagers trusted him implicitly, and a small dilution wouldn't make much of a difference, would it? At first, he hesitated. He had been raised on principles of honesty and fairness, values that had kept his family's reputation intact for generations. But as he stared at the milk, the temptation grew stronger. He rationalized his decision by telling himself that everyone in business found ways to maximize their profits. After all, merchants in the village often marked up their prices. Wasn't he simply doing the same? With a deep breath, he reached for a bucket of clean water and poured a small amount into the milk. He stirred it carefully, ensuring that the consistency remained unchanged. He convinced himself that the villagers wouldn't even notice. That day, he made his deliveries as usual, his heart pounding as he handed over the milk. Would anyone suspect him? Would they question its quality? To his relief, no one did. The villagers took the milk without hesitation, paying him the usual price. The realization hit him: he had just earned extra money without doing any extra work. A sense of excitement filled him. If a little water had gone unnoticed, what if he added just a bit more next time? Over the following weeks, Ramesh gradually increased the amount of water he added to the milk. He was careful, ensuring that it still appeared thick and creamy. With the extra money he made, he started indulging in small luxuries: a new pair of shoes, a finer meal at the market, and even gifts for himself. The guilt that had once gnawed at him began to fade, replaced by a sense of satisfaction. However, his greed soon blinded him. As he grew more comfortable with his deception, he became careless. The milk, once rich and nourishing, began to lose its quality. Some villagers started to notice that their tea tasted weaker, that their children were no longer as full after drinking the milk. Rumors began to spread: was Ramesh diluting the milk? At first, he dismissed these murmurs, believing that no one would dare accuse him directly. But the whispers grew louder. Some villagers started complaining, saying the milk didn't last as long as it used to. Others confronted him, asking if he had changed his practices. Ramesh, now accustomed to his wealth, denied the allegations with a confident smile. But deception can never last forever. The villagers, growing suspicious, decided to test the milk. One morning, a respected elder in the village took a sample and let it sit in a clay pot for hours. When the milk began to separate too quickly, he knew the truth: Ramesh had been adding water. The consequences of his greed were about to unfold. Ramesh had grown so accustomed to his new wealth that he believed his deception would never be uncovered. He convinced himself that the villagers were too trusting, too naive to notice the gradual decline in the quality of their milk. Day by day, he added more water to his supply, increasing his profits without increasing his workload. But what he failed to realize was that trust, once broken, is difficult to repair. At first, the changes were subtle. Some villagers noticed that their milk no longer had the same rich, creamy consistency. Mothers who used the milk for their children found that their tea and porridge tasted thinner, less nourishing. A few elders, long accustomed to the taste of pure milk, whispered among themselves that something wasn't right. Yet, because of the milkman's long-standing reputation, they hesitated to accuse him outright. But as time went on, the problem became impossible to ignore. The milk was spoiling faster than before, and the layer of cream that used to settle at the top of the containers had almost disappeared. One woman, who had been purchasing milk from Ramesh for years, took a sip and frowned. "This is not the same milk I've been drinking all my life," she murmured. Word spread quickly through the village. Neighbors gathered, discussing their suspicions. Some tried boiling the milk and noticed that it curdled too easily, a sign that it had been diluted. Others compared notes, realizing that they were all experiencing the same issue. Finally, the villagers decided that enough was enough. They had to confront Ramesh and demand the truth. One morning, as Ramesh arrived in the village square with his usual containers of milk, he was met with a crowd of angry faces. The village elder, a man who had known Ramesh's father, stepped forward. "Ramesh," he said sternly, "we have something to discuss." Ramesh forced a smile, though his heart pounded in his chest. "Of course, elder. What seems to be the problem?" "The milk you have been selling us is not the same as it used to be," the elder continued. "It is thin, spoils quickly, and lacks the richness we once enjoyed. Many of us have noticed." "Tell us the truth, have you been adding water to the milk?" For a brief moment, Ramesh considered lying. He thought about dismissing their concerns, calling it a misunderstanding. But as he looked around at the villagers, people who had trusted him for years, people who had supported his family's business, he saw the disappointment in their eyes. The realization hit him: his greed had not only increased his wealth but had also cost him something far more valuable, his honor and trust. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, one of the villagers held up a clay pot filled with milk. "We tested it," she said firmly. "It separates too quickly. This is not pure milk." Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. Ramesh felt a cold sweat on his brow. He had been exposed. His deception, which had once seemed like an easy way to make money, had now placed his entire livelihood at risk. The villagers were not just customers, they were his community, his neighbors, the people who had supported his family's trade for generations. And now, because of his greed, he stood on the verge of losing everything. Would he admit his mistake? Or would he attempt to deceive them further? Ramesh knew that whatever he said next would determine his fate. Ramesh stood frozen as the angry murmurs of the villagers surrounded him. His once loyal customers, the people who had trusted him and his family for years, now looked at him with suspicion and disappointment. The realization was overwhelming: his greed had not only brought him temporary wealth but had also destroyed something far more valuable, his honor. At first, he attempted to defend himself. "You misunderstand," he said, forcing a nervous smile. "Perhaps the cows have been producing thinner milk lately. The seasons change, and so does the milk." But the village elder shook his head. "We are not fools, Ramesh. We know the taste of pure milk. Your father never deceived us like this. He built this business on trust. And you have betrayed that trust." The weight of those words crushed Ramesh's remaining confidence. The villagers began murmuring among themselves. Some said they would no longer buy from him. Others suggested going to another milk supplier in a neighboring village. For the first time since he had started diluting the milk, Ramesh felt true fear, not of being caught, but of being abandoned. The next morning, when he went to deliver milk, many doors remained shut. Customers who once greeted him warmly now refused to meet his eyes. Some returned their milk, saying they no longer trusted his product. His sales plummeted. The wealth he had accumulated through his deceit suddenly seemed meaningless in the face of his failing business. Ramesh tried to make amends, promising that he would return to selling pure milk, swearing that he had learned his lesson. But trust, once broken, is not easily restored. The villagers were cautious. Many had already found alternative sources for their milk, unwilling to take another chance on the man who had deceived them. Days turned into weeks, and Ramesh's earnings dwindled. The luxuries he had once enjoyed, the fine clothes, the extravagant meals, were now beyond his reach. He struggled to afford even the basic necessities. The very greed that had driven him to seek more wealth had now left him poorer than before, not just financially but also in reputation and respect. One evening, he sat outside his home, staring at the empty milk cans that once held the key to his success. He thought of his father, who had spent his entire life building a legacy of honesty and hard work. How disappointed he would be to see what his son had done. With a heavy heart, Ramesh realized that wealth gained through deception never lasts. Greed had cost him everything that truly mattered. And now, he was left with nothing but regret. As Ramesh sat in solitude, reflecting on his downfall, he finally understood the weight of his actions. His greed, which once seemed like a clever means to success, had instead led to his ruin. He had sought wealth without effort, choosing deception over honesty, and in the end, he had lost not only his business but also the trust and respect of the people who once valued him. The villagers had moved on, finding other sources of milk. No matter how much he pleaded or promised to change, they remained wary. Trust, he realized, was like glass once shattered, it could never be fully restored. His regret grew deeper as he recalled how his father had run the business with dignity, never once compromising on integrity. If only he had followed in his father's footsteps instead of chasing easy wealth, he would still have the respect of his community. The lesson was clear: greed and dishonesty may offer temporary gains, but they ultimately lead to one's downfall. Ramesh had thought he was outsmarting the villagers, but in reality, he had only been digging his own grave. He learned that true success is not measured by wealth alone, but by the honesty, trust, and fairness with which one conducts their life. With a heavy heart, he resolved to change. Though it would take time, he knew he had to earn back the trust he had lost. But whether the villagers would ever forgive him remained uncertain. What was certain, however, was that he would never again allow greed to cloud his judgment. The story of the greedy milkman stands as a cautionary tale, reminding us all that in the pursuit of wealth, integrity should never be sacrificed, for once lost, it may never be regained.